Welcome, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hi, David.
How's it going?
It's going well. And with us this weekend, Emma Kinema. She is the campaign lead for the Campaign to Organize Digital Employees, or CODE, for the Communication Workers of America. She's also the co-founder of Game Workers Unite. Emma, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure.
So give us a little bit more of an introduction for you, and also the need to organize sort of digital spaces and game developing, for instance. And also give us your sort of view of, I remember growing up, the sort of idea of working at a game studio was, awesome. Like mid 2000s, that seemed like a utopia. I think the patina has worn off a little bit as like concepts like the crunch have gotten a little bit mainstream, but give us a little bit of background there.
Yeah, for sure. I guess to touch on the first, I'm a former game developer myself. I've done, things ranging from narrative to design to QA, production, things like that, for a wide range of different types of studios. And, in terms of organizing, it's been a part of my life for maybe 9 or 10 years, well before I was a developer. And so, as I entered my career in terms of the games industry, it felt pretty natural to just kind of merge those two things together. I really firmly believe that, really anyone who has progressive ideals, especially if you're on the left, or you call yourself socialist or whatever, you should be very active and engaged in union organizing, because I think it's one of the most fundamental ways we build power as workers. And so even though there wasn't a whole lot of movement going on in my industry, and I think a lot of people would have said, why the hell would game developers need to organize in the first place? Myself and a bunch of others got kind of to the work, and obviously things have really grown a lot since Game Workers Unite first was started in 2018. Now there's like multiple unions around the world organizing in different countries, different approaches. In the US, there's been a number of kind of different organizing pushes at different companies from time to time. But that's kind of, I would say, the short view of that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting sort of lessons, or kind of difficult case studies also. For instance, boycotts, right? Like when and just how important video games are to culture. I remember in high school refreshing IGN for the next release of a preview screenshot of Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. And so now when a new Rockstar Games production is coming out, and people, the sort of kids that are refreshing looking for that stuff, are seeing stuff about like the crunch. Just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, we've just seen an absolutely fundamental shift in the way we talk about the industry, both within it and, as you're saying, in terms of players and just the general populace. I've run into just random people who've, learned that I was a game developer, and were like, oh, I've heard about, the crunch and stuff. Like, those work conditions sound ridiculous. And these are not people who play games or even follow anything about the industry, right? So we definitely have a very different thing in our hands here. And to me, it really signals the maturing of our industry, which is also why I think we're seeing lots of different attempts at organizing starting to really actually catch hold. And organization as a thing, really, I think in the last Game Developers Conference survey, I think it was some 50 some odd percent of game developers said that they would be interested in having a union to have more rights and a voice at work, right? Which I think is kind of unheard of beyond a few years ago. And that shift, I think, mirrors a similar pattern, I would say, in the film and TV industries. In the 20s and 30s in particular, there wasn't a whole lot of organization. It was a relatively new industry. People would kind of sacrifice a lot to get it because it was seen as like this dream job. It was like this kind of new Wild West, to use a bad term. And but by the 40s and the 50s, and certainly by the 60s, union organization was really solid, like throughout the vast bulk of the industry. And it, brought better crediting practice, better employment, and standardizing conditions and all kinds of things. And I think we're in a similar arc where, if for us, I guess you would look at the late 80s, 90s, early thousands as kind of those first kind of decades of a really new kind of raw industry kind of emerging. And then now we've had enough cycles of, bad practices at studios, enough cycles where, whole generations of game developers leave the industry because they just can't deal with it anymore. And we lose all that talent and creativity, that brain drain. I think people are finally seeing that cycle and are now realizing that we have systemic issues that need to be addressed, and unions are systemic solutions to systemic issues. And so that's why we're starting to see, I think, this period, these last few years, where we see an increased interest in organizing.
No, I just wanted to ask, just for clarification, for some people who are sort of outside of that industry,
Sure.
for people, who are workers in that industry, is it typical for somebody sort of to be like attached to a studio, or do people sort of move around from project to project typically? Like, what's the kind of, I'm sure there's probably a lot of variation in different jobs and stuff like that, but just for a general understanding, what is that like for people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say the typical average experience is being rooted to a certain company or studio for a time.
Mhm.
But even for those folks, there's kind of an unspoken rule in the industry that, you're never going to move in your career. You're never going to get promoted or move up unless you jump from studio to studio,
Hmm.
and leverage those kind of offers against themselves. So, you know, there's a lot of movement around the industry, even within that more typical kind of employment situation of having a particular company. And then there's, of course, just huge freelance, like portions of the workforce. There's lots of like vendor and temp company workers who are just like this massive unseen foundation for the entire industry. And those, of course, very different to say like a developer who sits in studio at a place like Treyarch or something making Call of Duty.
Yeah, because you yourself were a Q&A tester, right? That's you had a good interview, I think, with New York Magazine, where you talked about the kind of perception versus reality of that, and how, like, is that, I could imagine, first of all, that being as somebody who plays a lot of games, that being a very difficult job, not only like the stress of, like you say, bumping your head into each wall to try to make sure you don't go through it. And like, if you make a mistake, everyone's gonna like post it online and make fun of it or something like that. Is that like the sort of job, like, I imagine like a major corporation would be like, okay, we have a whole bunch of people who will QA test all of your stuff, and you don't have to do that in-house. It's like that and monopolization, like the big firms, are those like, talk about, like, I guess to kind of like build on David's question a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, definitely part of my experiences in QA. I've had definitely a range of really bad to pretty okay experiences in QA. And I think a lot of people imagine a quality assurance tester in games would mostly just be like, well, you're playing games all day and that's pretty chill. That sounds like a nice job. But it's not. It's not playing the games every day. It's like you said, kind of bumping into the same wall over and over to make sure that the collision works, and you're testing certain things that take like an hour just to try to reproduce a certain bug someone saw one time because it crashed the console, and we got to make sure we figure it out. Just like it can be really tedious and monotonous at times too. And then of course QA testers on the whole are essentially the least well paid, the most poorly treated, the most unstable in terms of their employment in the industry, even though it's a massive foundation to the whole thing in terms of like actually making quality product that can ship and people will actually buy. And yeah, like you were saying, there's a lot of outsourcing in particular for QA, where a lot of larger name studios that people will know will often, yeah, just totally not have a whole lot of in-house QA, and have really cheap labor from Quebec or the UK or wherever, which is a bit of a problem sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to move to the Activision Blizzard thing, but this reminds me of a story I heard of somebody who did a QA experience for Nintendo. And the route to it was kind of like an Alice in Wonderland thing, where they answered an ad where wasn't for Nintendo, it was for a nondescript company, and then they had to go through a whole bunch of hoops, and it was only after like 5 that they found out it was for Nintendo, and that was great. And then they QA tested for a few months, and then that was the end of their contract with them. let's talk about the Activision Blizzard situation and the Jeff Strain letter. That's what really sort of brought this to my attention. He basically said it's time for unionization. He's a former senior Blizzard employee who is a developer on titles like StarCraft, Diablo, World of Warcraft. What should people know about this this whole Activision Blizzard? It's pretty indicative of what we're talking about, I think.
Yeah, I mean, for folks who aren't aware, there's a lawsuit from the state of California against Activision Blizzard for essentially a completely endemic situation of toxic workplace culture, harassment, abuse, things like that. Unfortunately, it's not a surprise to pretty much anyone in the industry, at least if you're a woman or someone who's marginalized in some way. And frankly, I've never worked at a studio where elements of that culture weren't present, even at the best studios I went to.
I just want to cut in to say, the lawsuit mentions frat boy culture as the terminology, which I think raises some questions about the allowance of frats. But anyway, let's stay with video games for now.
Yeah, no, and in some studios it really is kind of actually more real frat boy culture of just like open hostility. A lot more common. It's a lot more kind of subtle, I guess you would say, and kind of just baked into how people relate and how women are treated and how folks of color do or don't get promotions and all kinds of things. But yeah, it's, I think a major step to see the state of California pursuing this lawsuit. I think it's a good opportunity for a lot of the people who are affected. But again, I think a lot of the times in this industry, we talk about problems all the time. We talk about sexism and racism and ableism and homophobia in our industry all the time. Every conference, every time developers get together in any format, we're always talking about it. But we always talk about it as these, like, I would say almost like these whack-a-mole situations where like this studio is a problem and that guy's a problem and this game development process was terrible or whatever. And we need to understand that they are systemic issues. They're not isolated. It's not isolated to Activision Blizzard or anything. So, again, I would say like unionization is the systemic solution because social justice and economic justice are inherently interwoven, right? Because for instance, women, marginalized folks, queer folks, what have you, we're on the whole much less economically stable in our industry, which means we have to run a mental calculation of, do I want to be, that queer person in the office who's speaking up against, this thing that's actually really transphobic in our game and run the risk of, essentially killing my career here in the shorter long term. Whereas, for instance, if we had a union contract that had a, just cause clause in it, which is pretty typical, essentially just saying like the company can't on a whim fire or lay off someone unless they have a financial need to do so or the person's not performing well. And so that creates a culture where marginalized people can actually speak out more effectively at work and in a more safe manner. It would really, I think economic stability and, is just so foundational to creating an actual healthy culture that's inclusive and accessible and not harmful to marginalized folks. And just one last thing would be like, people talk about ending pay equality in our industry. Well, there's literally no way better to do that than a union contract that sets up pay in a clear, transparent way based off of, I have this title, I have this amount of experience, so I make this much money.
Yeah. No, I mean it's just it's very clear too, and also being able to address some of these general like social justice issues is going to take workers' power. And it's been an interesting kind of shift, or I'm sure it's always been a part of union conversations, but I feel like it's really been focused on in the tech industry and the digital industry over the past couple of years, where, even for people who get paid fairly well, right, compared to like most, average American workers, the pitch is that, these are very important companies that have a lot of cultural influence or technological influence in our society. And we want to make sure that they're representing, positive messages and images and things of that nature. Yeah. And the only, like, to just constantly, even if you're somebody who's not worried about retaliation, right. To just constantly, putting yourself you know, throwing yourself out there in meetings is not really like the most ideal situation either. Instead, having an entire group of people, an entire organization, basically being able to make demands and have those demands met, I think it's a really interesting development.
Yeah, and you know, there's so many reasons why we need union organization in tech and digital media and all sorts of fields, really. Because you know, I think a lot of people will be like, "Well, unions are for coal miners or whatever." That's a pretty typical argument, which I find funny because one of my friends is a union coal miner and thinks that's bullshit. But essentially, like, it doesn't always come down to pay, and in fact, most union organizing campaigns don't win because they talk about pay and bread and butter stuff like that. You know, even if you're organizing at a coffee shop or if you're organizing teachers or whatever, it's never pay that wins a campaign or, you know, motivates people. It's always much more broad things around, you know, actually having dignity and rights and a voice at work and a process that's fair for people. And, you know, so people say, well, like, why would a well-paid, you know, developer for Activision Blizzard need a union? Well, there's so many things far beyond just simply getting a little pay bump or something that people can really benefit from, right? First off, a lot of people do need a pay bump in our industry because it's really, really, you know, discriminatory in a lot of ways. But also just like all these intangible things, these qualitative things that come when we do approach issues as a systemic problem. And when, like you're saying, we're not just approaching issues as I'm speaking up as me, but all of us together have like discussed this and debated this, and we're moving forward together on whatever issue. It just completely changes the culture of a workplace, just a total 180 from, you know, the top down dictatorship of a single person versus humans actually having agency and voice over where they spend the vast majority of their lives, right? And of course, you're going to make better games and better product and better software that's better for us, better for our communities, better for our companies even, if we have that kind of agency.
Yeah, that's why I think it's so encouraging that the strain letter, I think, overpowered the, I think, confused calls for like a boycott, for instance, as a way that we're, you know, in America particularly, like, we're so empowered as consumers. That's the only way we can think to fight something. And like the more that we can just have sort of jerk that reaction into, let's empower the workers themselves, I think that's the trend line we need to be pushing.
Yeah, absolutely. And you definitely hit the nail on the head with the boycott thing. I feel like every time some news piece comes out about a studio that had some bad incident happen or a bad, you know, production process get exposed, everyone's first reaction is like, oh, well, I'm going to boycott Rockstar. I'm going to boycott Activision Blizzard or whatever, when the workers haven't called for that. Right? If the workers do call for something like that, you respect it. Like, for instance, you know, the workers at Nabisco who are on strike right now are calling for people not to cross the picket line and not, you know, buy and sell those products, you know. But it's really about, again, centering that agency of the workers themselves and not just having reactive ways of addressing issues that are kind of a band-aid, whether it's from a consumer angle or even from a more worker-driven angle. What needs to happen is we actually proactively need to have say and control in our conditions in our workplace over the quality of our product and so on. And that is actually how we, you know, address it long term. And I think Jeff Strain's letter is a really interesting example where, you know, this employer who was, you know, one of the co-founders of ArenaNet, the founder of Undead Labs, these relatively well-known studios, even he can acknowledge, as someone who is a business owner, right, not on the worker end, he can acknowledge that, you know, unionization would be beneficial. It brings a certain level of maturity to the workforce in the industry. It brings a certain level of stability to an industry that is sometimes really chaotic. And so I think he understands that need for it. Now, would he sign a, you know, card check neutrality agreement and actually, you know, put those words into practice so that way when his workers do organize, there's not some big drawn out kerfuffle around it where they have to go through a bureaucratic, terrible, broken labor law process to get the union recognized? You know, who's to say? Hopefully that is the case. But it's at least an interesting new evolution in the conversation on organizing to now also have a few examples. I can list maybe like 8 off the top of my head in terms of bosses in the industry who also think they and their companies and the industry would benefit from organizing.
Oh no, I just wanted to ask while we have you here, just because we sort of touched on it, but I think some of our audience is probably very familiar with like video games and the term like the crunch. But could you just explain like what that experience is like for people who might not be familiar with what that means?
Yeah. So crunch is really most harmful in some of the qualitative aspects of it. And it really does range from company to company. You know, sometimes people will have a 60-hour work week and we call that crunch. And maybe it is because they should be working 40 hours or what have you. But the most brutal examples are when, you know, people work 6 or 7 days a week for months on end, where you are missing, you know, events where you're with your kids and your family, where you are, you know, dropping everything in your life except for work and going home to sleep and coming back to work. You know, issues where the just the human need of the people making the games are not even considered as a factor in production, right? It also is something where it sets up this recurring dynamic where, you know, if the executives and production staff can get away with having people crunch on one game or in one big kind of project push, then they'll know, well, we can just bake that into the calendar for next time. And it doesn't become like even a reactive thing to when the project is, you know, unexpectedly taking too long and people are having to haul ass to get it done. It becomes like a endemic thing that is now baked into the process of a certain studio or company. And it essentially just, I think, erodes any sense of control and human well-being from there, because it just totally decimates any sense of control you can have, even if you're over your own personal life outside of work. You know, I've had to, you know, get text messages on like a Sunday where a producer will be like, hey, can you come to the office? We really have to do XYZ, get out the door by Monday, because some random executive or something asked for it sooner than we expected. And it's like, well, okay, I guess I will. And I guess my day is just shot. And I'm going to show up on Monday as if it was just the start of a normal week somehow. So yeah, it just like, it's a very corrosive thing. It really does take over your whole life. It's not just a bad workplace.
And I mean, the workplace sort of, I mean, the way power's divided, or like if you have a union, like you mentioned in the New York Meg article I'll link to, there are times where you may want to, as a group of workers, work in this intense kind of way. But if you're making that decision as a unit, as opposed to as, you know, the executives upstairs saying, hey, you know, we got to get this done, everyone's going to have to, you know, come in on Saturday. It's a completely different context.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people have this straw man argument against, you know, people who are interested in organizing, and that like, well, we just want to work less and fewer hours, and we don't understand the need for, you know, sometimes overtime work. But it's really not the case. Like it's just a night and day difference between having an actual say when, you know, the producer says, you know what, we're way behind our milestone on this. We need to figure out some way to move it ahead, for the workers actually to be able to have a meaningful voice. And, you know, we get to question whether, do we all come crunch? Do we like work in different waves? Do we hire additional temp staff? Or do we maybe scope down the project, right? Or move some portion of the work we were hoping to get done, right? It's just a totally different thing. And for me, I'm not so interested in terms of like ending any overtime work as like a general practice. I want to make sure it's opt-in and negotiable, because I've never worked at a game studio where it was negotiable. Even if they said it was, you knew it wasn't. And if you didn't do it routinely, they would see you as like a bad employee, even though you're just asserting boundaries that they asked you to assert in the first place.
No, I just wanted to comment on top of it, like the strawman argument that, yeah, like anyone who's interested in organizing is just essentially trying to be lazy. And anyone who's familiar with what goes into an organizing campaign will know that that's not really something that's taking work off of your plate, right?
There's literally no one who cares about their workplace more and works harder than worker organizers on the shop floor organizing a union, because not only do you have to do your job in addition to the organizing work, you also have to do your job to perfection because any flaw the boss will use as a target on your back to get you out of the office. And then in addition to that, the rest of your fucking free time, you are literally talking to your coworkers constantly about the workplace, about the projects we're doing, about the quality of the work, about the relationships between different teams and how things could improve. And that is an example of someone who cares deeply about the workplace. They're not just organizing because they want to throw middle finger to management. They're organizing because they care about the game, about the product they make, about their coworkers, sometimes even more than themselves. You know, I know people who've organized not because they want even better conditions themselves, but, you know, a better sense of control over the quality of their project, or, you know, better ways to progress in their career, and all kinds of different things that one might not think at first glance when you think of a union organizer.
Emma, where would you direct people's action if they are excited by this conversation?
Yeah, well, I mean, you should reach out to me and other organizers. You can go to code-cwa.org. We've got a contact form if people want to, you know, get some advice on how to organize. We work with just dozens and dozens of people. We get constantly people reaching out. So if you're interested in organizing, you know, there's a lot of people like you out there doing that work, even though it doesn't seem like it sometimes. 99% of organizing work is underground. It's not seen. It's not the big flashy stuff like Activision Blizzard workers walking out. It's, again, you know, talking to your coworkers and focusing on the issues and all that kind of work. So if that sounds appealing to someone, they should get in touch, and we can help them organize.
All right. Thank you very much, folks. We will see you on Wednesday.